A police officer found a newborn crying in a trash can, and the sight left him shaken. He thought his job ended the night he saved that child, but years later, life had one more surprise in store for him. Stay tuned to uncover the shocking twist and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The streets of Willow Creek were quiet, the kind of silence that made a man's thoughts louder. Lucas Carter, a seasoned police officer, drove slowly through the dimly lit roads, his routine patrol unfolding like it had 1,000 times before. At 39 years old, Lucas had spent more than half his life in uniform, serving a town that was peaceful on the surface but hiding shadows in its corners. Tonight felt different. Something gnawed at him, an unease he couldn't shake. Maybe it was the chill in the air, or maybe it was the way the streetlights flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows across the pavement. Then he heard it, a sound so faint, so fragile, that for a moment he thought it was the wind whistling through the alley. But no, it was a cry. Lucas slowed the car, his pulse quickening. He strained his ears. It was unmistakable now. A baby's cry. His breath caught in his throat. Who in their right mind would leave a baby out here, in the dead of night? He threw the car into park, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out, boots crunching against the asphalt. The crying grew louder, desperate, coming from the dumpster near the edge of the park. His gut twisted. Please, let me be wrong. But he knew. He already knew. Lucas reached the dumpster and hesitated for only a second before yanking the lid open. His heart stopped. Inside, wrapped in a filthy, torn blanket, was a newborn baby boy. Small, fragile, barely alive. For the first time in years, Lucas felt fear, not for himself, for this child. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He reached in, scooping up the tiny body, feeling the icy skin beneath his fingers. The baby was shivering, his cries weak. Lucas held him close, shielding him from the cold night air. His grip tightened protectively. "Who the hell did this to you?" he whispered, scanning the empty streets. No answer, no sign of the monster who left him here. He wasn't letting go. With urgency, Lucas pulled out his radio. "I need an ambulance, now. Newborn, severe hypothermia. I'm bringing him in." The dispatcher's response barely registered. Lucas was already moving, cradling the baby against his chest, his heartbeat racing in sync with the child's fragile whimpers. Something inside him shifted, a feeling he didn't expect. This baby wasn't just another case. He didn't know why, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to protect this child. Lucas didn't stop moving. His pulse pounded as he rushed to his patrol car, the tiny, fragile body in his arms. The baby was still crying, but his voice was weak, his breath shallow. That terrified Lucas more than anything. He threw open the passenger door, cradled the baby against his chest with one hand, and turned the heat up as high as it would go. This kid needed warmth. Now. "Stay with me, little guy," he murmured, wrapping the baby in his jacket. He was so small, so helpless. The hospital was minutes away, but every second felt like a lifetime. Lucas kept glancing down, checking the baby's face, making sure those tiny breaths kept coming. "You're okay," he said, more to himself than the baby. But was he? Who would do this? Lucas had seen plenty in his career: crime, desperation, cruelty. But this? Abandoning a newborn in a dumpster like trash? It made his stomach turn. As soon as he reached the hospital, he jumped out, baby in arms, and ran through the doors. "Help! I've got a newborn. Found him in a dumpster. He's freezing." The emergency team sprang into action, rushing forward, clearing a path. A nurse reached out to take the baby, but Lucas hesitated, his grip tightening for just a second before forcing himself to let go. He followed as they wheeled the baby inside, his legs moving on autopilot. He wasn't even supposed to be here anymore. His job was done, but something kept him from walking away. As the doctors worked, Lucas stood back, arms crossed, jaw clenched. His uniform was still dusted with the dirt from that dumpster, but he didn't care. "Newborn hypothermic," one of the nurses reported. "Severely dehydrated, malnourished, but stable." Lucas exhaled. Stable. For the first time since he heard that cry, his chest loosened just a little. A nurse approached him. A kind-looking woman in her early 50s, her voice calm but firm. "You're the officer who found him?" Lucas nodded. She glanced back at the incubator where the baby lay, now wrapped in a soft, clean hospital blanket. "He's lucky you got to him in time," she said. A few more hours out there and... She trailed off, shaking her head. Do you want to sit with him? Lucas blinked. He wasn't sure why, but his feet started moving before his brain even made the decision. He sat down beside the incubator, watching the tiny chest rise and fall, slow and steady now, a sharp contrast to the desperate, uneven gasps from before. The baby squirmed a little, a small whimper escaping his lips. Lucas swallowed. This kid had no one. The nurse spoke again. He doesn't have a name yet. Do you want to give him one? Lucas's throat tightened. A name. He looked down at the tiny face, soft and completely innocent, despite the cruel way the world had introduced itself to him. Oliver, Lucas said, before he could stop himself. The nurse smiled. Oliver, that's a strong name. Lucas nodded. Yeah, strong. And suddenly he knew he wasn't walking away from this. Oliver wasn't just another case. He was something more. And Lucas wasn't done protecting him. Lucas sat in the hospital room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the tiny boy in the incubator. Oliver. He hadn't planned on getting attached, hadn't expected to feel this protective pull. But the moment he found Oliver in that dumpster, something changed, and now he couldn't shake it. For 3 days he kept coming back. He had no real reason to. The case was technically closed, but every spare moment, he found himself back in that chair beside Oliver's crib, watching him grow stronger, healthier. The nurses had started to notice. Back again? One of them teased, handing Lucas a cup of coffee. He didn't bother denying it. Oliver was alone in the world. No parents had come forward. No missing persons report had been filed. Who did this to you, kid? Lucas had already pulled hospital records, birth certificates, police reports. Nothing. It was as if Oliver had never existed before that night. And that thought made Lucas sick. The baby kicked his tiny legs, eyes fluttering open. Lucas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Hey there, little guy. His voice came out quieter than expected. You're looking better today. Oliver blinked up at him, his small fingers twitching. Lucas let out a slow breath. This was dangerous. Getting attached? That wasn't in the plan. He was a cop, not a father. His life was about long hours, dangerous calls, cases that never really ended. But every time he looked at Oliver, the same question came back. What if? The 4th day, Lucas arrived at the hospital with something weighing on him. The thought had been brewing for days, but now? It was almost fully formed. Could he do it? Could he adopt Oliver? His mind told him no. His job was too risky. His life wasn't built for a kid. He wasn't meant to be a father. But his heart had already made its choice. As he stepped into the hospital room, his decision all but made, he saw something that made him freeze. A man and a woman stood beside Oliver's crib. They looked well-dressed, polished, upper class, the kind of people who had never seen the inside of a police station unless it was for a charity gala. The nurse from before approached him with a soft expression. They're here to adopt him. Lucas's chest tightened. He looked at Oliver, his Oliver, kicking and cooing in the crib, unaware that his entire world was about to change. The woman turned to Lucas, offering a smile. Are you the officer who found him? He nodded, feeling like the air had been knocked out of his lung. She reached out, touching his arm gently. We can't have children. When we heard about Oliver, we knew he was meant to be ours. Lucas swallowed hard. They weren't bad people. In fact, they were probably the best possible outcome for Oliver. Wealthy, stable, a life full of opportunity. But something in Lucas screamed that this wasn't how it was supposed to go. The nurse spoke again, softer this time. They've already started the paperwork. Lucas clenched his fists. So that was it. He hadn't even had the chance to say the words out loud, hadn't even had the chance to fight for him. The woman turned back to the crib, brushing her fingers gently across Oliver's cheek. He's perfect, she whispered. Lucas's stomach twisted. He took a step closer, forcing himself to look at Oliver one last time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, What are you going to name? The man smiled. Oh, we're keeping his name, Oliver. Lucas exhaled sharply, his throat tight. For some reason, that mattered. They wouldn't know why he chose the name, wouldn't understand what it meant, but they were keeping it. And that was something. He forced himself to nod, forced himself to step back. Take care of him, he said, his voice gruff, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then, before he could change his mind, he turned and walked away. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time he reached the hospital doors, his eyes burned. The doors of Willow Creek Hospital slid shut behind him, but Lucas Carter's world never felt the same again. He had done the right thing. He told himself that over and over, Oliver would have a good life, a better life. But the truth? It never stopped hurting. The years passed in a blur of cases, crime scenes, and late nights that bled into early mornings. Lucas, now 62 years old, has climbed the ranks, from officer to detective, then to chief investigator, the man everyone called when the cases were too complicated, too dangerous, or too tangled in lies. His name carried weight. His record spoke for itself, but none of it filled the void. Lucas had spent his entire life solving mysteries, yet the one case that mattered most, the only one that truly haunted him, was the one he was never able to close. Oliver. He never found out where the boy ended up. He had searched, of course, checked records, pulled adoption files, scanned news articles, anything that might give him a clue. But the wealthy couple that had taken Oliver had kept him out of the system, off the radar. Lucas told himself it was for the best. And still, every now and then, he caught himself wondering, was he happy? Was he safe? Did he ever wonder about the officer who found him that night? There were no answers, just silence. Until the day he walked through the door, the low hum of the police station barely registered in Lucas's mind as he sat at his desk, flipping through a cold case that had been collecting dust for years. It should have had his full attention. It didn't. Something about today felt different. Then, a knock. Lucas glanced up, expecting a fellow officer. Instead, a young man stood in the doorway. Tall, well-dressed, early 20s. Lucas's instincts sharpened immediately. He didn't recognize him, but something about him felt familiar. The young man took a slow step forward. "Are you Officer Lucas Carter?" Lucas straightened, his detective instincts on high alert. The voice, steady, polite, but carrying something underneath. A hesitation, a nervous energy. Lucas leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Who's asking?" The young man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. Then he smiled. A smile that hit Lucas like a freight train. "My name is Oliver." The case file in Lucas's hands slipped to the floor. Everything, the office, the station, the last 2 decades of his life, blurred into nothing. For a moment, Lucas couldn't move. He sat frozen, his mind struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Oliver, the boy he had found in a dumpster, the child he had named, the one he had been forced to let go of 23 years ago, was now standing in front of him. And yet, Lucas couldn't say a word. His grip on the armrest tightened as he took in the young man before him, tall, confident, well-dressed, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He looked successful, like he belonged in some executive boardroom, not a police station. Oliver. Lucas finally breathed, the name feeling foreign yet familiar on his tongue. The young man's smile wavered slightly, like he wasn't sure how to read Lucas's reaction. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me," Oliver admitted, shifting his weight slightly. Lucas let out a sharp exhale. "Remember you?" His voice was rougher than he intended. He shook his head, leaning forward. "I never forgot you." Oliver's eyes flickered with something unspoken, relief, maybe, or something deeper. Lucas sat motionless, staring at the young man across from him. For 23 years, he had wondered if Oliver was safe, if he had lived a good life, and now, here he was, alive, grown, standing right in front of him. But something was off. Why now? Oliver wasn't here just to say thank you. Lucas could see it in his posture, in the way his fingers tapped against his knee, a restless energy, like a man carrying a weight too heavy to hold alone. Lucas leaned forward, his voice steady. "Why did you come looking for me, Oliver?" The young man exhaled, looking down at his hands before finally meeting Lucas's gaze. "My adoptive parents passed away recently," he admitted. "They left me everything, the house, their business, all of it. But when I was going through their things, I found something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, aged envelope. Lucas took it carefully, noticing the name scrawled across the front in faded ink. For Oliver. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he slid out the folded letter inside. The paper was fragile, the handwriting delicate but urgent. He began to read. "My dearest Oliver, there is something we never told you. You were not meant to be ours. We found you, abandoned, with no name, no family. But You were loved from the moment we held you in our arms. I don't know why you were left behind, but I hope one day you find the truth. I hope you find the people who should have been there for you. And I hope you know, no matter what, you were never unwanted in our eyes." Lucas could hear the blood rushing in his ears. Oliver sat still, watching him. "They never told me I was adopted, not once." His voice was low, careful. "I spent my entire life thinking I was their biological son." Lucas closed his eyes briefly. They had kept the truth from him. When he opened them again, Oliver's face was unreadable. "I thought I knew who I was," he said quietly. "But now, I don't know anything. I don't know where I came from. I don't know why I was abandoned. All I know is that you're the only person who can help me find out." Lucas felt something shift inside him. Lucas placed the letter down carefully. Then he looked Oliver straight in the eye. "You want to know where you came from?" he asked. Oliver nodded. "More than anything." Lucas took a deep breath. He pushed back from his desk, grabbed a notebook, and flipped open his laptop. "Tell me everything you've already checked," he said. Oliver leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I started with my birth certificate, but it doesn't list anything except my adoptive parents' names. I checked county records, no official adoption paperwork, no foster system files. As far as the government is concerned, I didn't exist until my parents brought me home." Lucas frowned. "That's unusual. Even private adoptions leave a paper trail." Oliver exhaled sharply. "That's what I thought, but there's nothing." Lucas rubbed his jaw. No records meant one of two things. Either the adoption was done completely off the books, or someone had gone to great lengths to erase the details. He pulled out a legal pad and scribbled down a list. Birth records, hospital logs, adoption inquiries. They had to follow every possible lead. "Tell me how you found me," Lucas asked. Oliver reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, aged document. Lucas took it, and his stomach tightened the moment he saw it. The police report from the night he had found Oliver. His own handwriting stared back at him. "Infant male, discovered 11:47 p.m. in Willow Creek Park. Placed into emergency medical care." The last line sent a chill through him. "Reporting officer, Sergeant Lucas Carter." "My parents must have kept it," Oliver explained. "It was in a locked box with the letter. I don't think they ever wanted me to see it." Lucas scanned the details again. It was basic, just enough to document the discovery, but it wouldn't tell them anything about who had left Oliver there. "You were the only name on the report," Oliver said, watching him carefully. "So I started looking you up." Lucas smirked slightly. "And?" Oliver gave him a small, knowing smile. "Turns out, you're kind of a big deal." Lucas huffed. "Don't believe everything you read." Oliver's smirk faded as his expression turned serious again. "I knew I had to find you, because if anyone can help me figure out where I came from, it's you." Lucas felt something shift inside him again. For 23 years, Oliver had been a closed chapter, one Lucas had never allowed himself to reopen. But now, Oliver was handing him the key. Lucas took a breath. Then, he flipped to a new page in his notebook and met Oliver's gaze. "All right," he said. "Let's find out where you came from." Lucas worked fast, pulling up hospital records from 23 years ago. "No adoption papers means we go back to the night I found you. If we find out where you were born, we'll get answers." Oliver sat forward as Lucas scrolled through maternity ward records, narrowing the search to births around the time he was abandoned. Then, Lucas's eyes locked onto the name, Grace Turner. Admitted, 2 days before the infant's discovery. Complications during birth. Status of the infant, unknown. Lucas's gut tightened. She gave birth, but there's no record of what happened to the baby. Oliver's jaw clenched. "That has to be me." Lucas wrote down the name. "We find Grace Turner. We get answers." The name sat heavy on the page as Lucas leaned back in his chair, already knowing this wouldn't be easy. Oliver watched him closely. "What's next?" "We find out where she is now," Lucas said, typing her name into the state records database. If Grace was still alive, she'd have left a trail, a driver's license, a medical record, a tax filing. But as he scanned the results, his frown deepened. Nothing. Oliver caught the shift in his expression. "She's gone? She's missing." Lucas adjusted the filters, searching court filings, missing persons reports, anything. Then he found it. A police report from 23 years ago. Lucas read it aloud. "Grace Turner, reported missing by her landlord after failing to return home. Last seen 2 days before she gave birth. Case closed due to lack of leads. Oliver's face darkened. She disappeared right after having me. Lucas nodded, which means we're not just looking for your mother. We're looking for what happened to her. He jotted down the last known address. We start here, Lucas said. If Grace Turner is alive, we'll find her. If she's not. He met Oliver's gaze. We find out who didn't want her to be. Oliver's hands tightened into fists. Let's go. Lucas drove in silence, his thoughts sharp as he processed the case. Oliver sat beside him, his fingers drumming restlessly on his knee. There was no record of Grace Turner after she gave birth. No death certificate, no paper trail. People didn't just disappear, not without a reason. Lucas pulled up in front of the last known address, a rundown apartment building on the outskirts of Willow Creek. The place looked abandoned, windows cracked, weeds creeping through the pavement. Oliver took a breath. This is where she lived. 23 years ago, yeah, Lucas said. Let's see if anyone remembers her. They climbed the steps and knocked on the door. It took a moment before an elderly woman peered out, her eyes cautious. Lucas flashed his badge. Ma'am, we're looking for information about someone who used to live here, Grace Turner. At the name, the woman's face hardened. Oliver stepped forward. She was my mother. The woman studied him, then sighed. She was a good girl, kind, kept to herself. But she went missing. Lucas pressed. Did she say anything before she disappeared? The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. She was scared, said she was being followed. A few nights later, she was just gone. Lucas exchanged a glance with Oliver. This wasn't just an abandoned baby. Something bigger had happened. The woman leaned closer. If you're looking for the truth, find the woman who took her in after she disappeared, Margaret Harris. Lucas jotted down the name. Where can we find her? The woman hesitated. She passed a few years ago, but her son might know something. He still lives in town. Lucas nodded. Another lead. He turned to Oliver. Looks like we're paying him a visit. Lucas and Oliver drove straight to Margaret Harris's son, Paul, who ran a small repair shop just outside town. Paul eyed them warily when they arrived. I don't know what you're looking for, he said, wiping grease from his hands. Lucas didn't waste time. We're looking for information about Grace Turner. Your mother took her in after she disappeared. Paul's face hardened at the name. He hesitated, then motioned for them to follow him inside. She showed up at my mom's place one night, Paul said. Scared, desperate. She just had a baby, but she wasn't with him. Oliver's breath hitched. Did she say what happened? Paul nodded grimly. She said the hospital told her the baby had died, but she didn't believe them. She was convinced they lied. Lucas exchanged a sharp glance with Oliver. This was it. The missing piece. Paul continued. She said there were people who wanted her baby gone. She overheard doctors whispering about taking care of it. Next thing she knew, they told her he hadn't survived. Oliver clenched his fists. But I didn't die. They stole me. Paul exhaled. She tried to fight it, went to the police, but no one listened. A poor girl with no family? They dismissed her as unstable. Lucas felt his blood boil. What happened to her after that? Paul's expression darkened. One night, a car pulled up outside. 2 men forced her inside. My mom tried to stop them, but she was outnumbered. Oliver's face paled. She was kidnapped. Paul nodded. And no one ever saw her again. Lucas ran a hand over his face. This wasn't just an abandoned baby. Grace had been silenced. Oliver's voice was raw. She was looking for me, and they made sure she never found me. Paul pulled out an old, worn envelope. Before she was taken, she left this with my mom, she said. One day her son would come looking. Oliver took it with trembling hands, his throat tight as he unfolded the paper. If my son ever finds this, I never gave up on you. They took you from me. But I know you're out there. I love you, always. Oliver shut his eyes, exhaling slowly. Lucas placed a firm hand on his shoulder. She never stopped searching, kid. She never stopped fighting for you. Oliver nodded, swallowing hard. And now, I finally know the truth. Oliver sat in silence, staring at the letter in his hands. For 23 years, he had believed he was simply adopted, that his life had started the day his parents took him home. But now, he knew the truth. He had been stolen, his mother had been taken, and no one ever gave her the chance to fight for him. Lucas watched him closely. He had seen many people find closure in his years as an investigator, but never like this. After a long pause, Oliver finally spoke. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. She never gave up on me. Lucas nodded. No, she didn't. Oliver exhaled, his jaw tightening. And she never got justice. Lucas leaned forward. And that's something we can change. With Lucas's help, Oliver filed an official report on Grace Turner's disappearance. The case was reopened. The hospital that had taken her in was long shut down, but Lucas had pulled records showing that similar cases had happened before. Young women, vulnerable, with no family, whose babies had mysteriously died in the system. The department started digging. Witnesses were hard to find after so much time, but Lucas knew one thing. People like this always left a trail. And now, for the first time in decades, Grace Turner's name was back in the system, and Oliver was making sure she would never be forgotten again. 1 month later, Lucas and Oliver stood outside a modest house on the outskirts of town. The search was over. They had traced Grace Turner to a nearby town, alive but living under a different name. She had been rescued years ago after kidnapping, but with no family, no resources, and no proof of what happened to her son. She had never been able to fight back. Until now. Oliver's breathing was unsteady. She's in. Lucas nodded. You ready for this? Oliver exhaled. I've been waiting my whole life. With a slow, deliberate knock, Lucas rapped on the door. A moment later, it creaked open. Standing before them was a woman in her early 50s, her face worn but her eyes sharp. She studied them with confusion until her gaze landed on Oliver. For a moment, time stood still. Then she gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears flooding her eyes. My son? Oliver's face crumpled. He took a shaky step forward, barely able to find his voice. Mom? A single sob escaped her lips before she threw her arms around him, clutching him like she never wanted to let go. Lucas watched as a mother and son reunited after 23 years of separation, their tears soaking into each other's shoulders. Oliver wasn't lost anymore. And Grace? She had finally found the child they stole from her. Lucas gave them a moment, then stepped back, allowing them their space. He had done his part. As he turned to leave, Oliver suddenly looked up. Lucas, he called. Lucas stopped. Oliver pulled away from Grace just enough to look at him. Come inside. Lucas hesitated, but only for a second. Then, with a small smile, he stepped forward. After all, family wasn't always about blood. And for the first time in years, Lucas realized this was exactly where he was meant to be. Some stories remind us that love and truth cannot be erased, no matter how much time has passed. Grace Turner never stopped searching, even when the world told her to move on. Oliver never knew the fight that had been waged for him, but when he found the truth, it changed everything. And Lucas, he was more than just the officer who found Oliver. He was the man who made sure a mother's love wasn't lost to history. This story proves that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up, the people who fight for you, the people who never stop believing that you matter. If you discovered that everything you knew about your past was a lie, would you search for the truth, no matter what it might reveal? Or would you let the past stay buried? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your perspectives. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.